When the alt-right first came out and it was a sensation around like 2014, 2015, 2016, all the way up until Charlottesville, there were all these adjacent movements surrounding it and weren't necessarily alt-right, I guess, but there's all these adjacent movements that have like the overlapping spheres. And of all those adjacent movements that had overlapping spheres at that time, I would have never thought that the one that would have caught on and kind of enters into mainstream culture is the manosphere, the MGTOW and incel stuff. That's what's really clicked, it seems like to me. Um, and I mean, why shouldn't it? All you have to be in order to be um, in that kind of sphere is all you have to be a man, right? In order to be a white nationalist, first off, you got to be white. In order to be somebody that opposes democracy, you got to know enough about democracy or be intelligent enough to criticize it. In order to value religion, first of all, you had to be religious in the first place, or you got to have this sense of your own mortality. And I don't know, maybe after the coronavirus that happened a little bit, but I don't know if people are really understanding their own mortality these days still. So, at base value, the simplest us versus them that there really can be is the duality of men versus women. And I think that a lot of Zoomer and millennial women, even before the men's rights sphere kind of popped up, they're calling themselves feminists because of that very basic, the dumbest, the lowest totem pole, us versus them, men versus women. And I don't think that the average millennial woman or the average Zoomer woman really is like 100% understands what feminism is and is really a feminist in any meaningful sense. They'll only support things um, they'll only support vaguely feminist things in the moment if it benefits them as a person in the moment. They really don't understand feminism, period. And I guess maybe I'm being naive there or I'm being white pilled, but that's just the way I view it. But anyway, all these girls running around, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, I'm a feminist, it's going to cause a lot of reaction in men. So we shouldn't be surprised that now mirroring it, there's this rise of all this men's rights stuff. And even if they aren't, I guess cafeteria feminists, they'll really say men are shit, right? And so I guess in the stomach, when you hear men are shit, you're gonna say I'm not shit, and you're gonna choose the opposite. So you're gonna side with the manosphere stuff. And you know what? Indeed, without God, our decadent society is turned towards sex so much. It's what gives people meaning. So that's why people are really, really obsessed with feminism and men's rights stuff. Because, I mean, if you are an incel, what is the point of your life? What is the point of life if you're, you know, a 21-year-old angry virgin other than sex? There's no real higher goal to those people. So, in this atmosphere of confused misogyny and misandry to a certain extent, right? Um, a lot of men are going to look towards the Taliban as a strong and vile masculine group, which is unrestrained by the modern world. They have defeated the decadent West, and they have put men back in their place as the dominant holders of their society. Sure, they've done that by having a more extreme than Mohammed version of Islam, but, it seems like they're succeeding and we aren't, at least from a distance, at least from a momentary glance, right? Because if you're this incel type person that's super angry, why am I a virgin? Because all girls are really whores or doing the cock carousel nonsense, right? Well, fuck them. I'm gonna get mandatory. They're gonna have to be forced to marry me. They're gonna be stuck inside. Their dad is gonna give me away for sheep or something, right? And you get your sex, right? That's what the Taliban believes. Now that I got that out of the way, let's begin. Is the Taliban and the Emirate of Afghanistan, is it based? Well, first we got to start talking about what the Taliban are. The Taliban stands for students, or Islamic students. It's a movement which evolved out of the Afghan refugee madrasas. I'm sorry, I'm not the best pronouncer, okay? Madrasas. In Pakistan, as millions of Afghans fled the country in the wake of the Soviet invasion and the Civil War. That civil war being from until the Taliban starts up, right? They had constant warfare until 1978, until 1994, when the Taliban really starts to rise up. The communist government lasted from 78, and then the Soviets invaded in 79 to prop it up and put in their own more reliable dictator. The Soviets leave in 89, but the communist dictator stays up until 92. But once the communist government was overthrown in 92, you have these various rebel groups which were fighting the government, very loosely organized, going to war at each other, and the country breaks into numerous pieces with a much more destructive war between these innumerable warlords. And so, this new religious cult of refugee young students, led by a mysterious Mullah Omar, starts a group, the Taliban, the students, and they seek to end this chaos and reunify the country. And their fanatical devotion to kind of this primitive and novel interpretation of Islam, alongside with financial support from Pakistan, enabled them to unify the entire country with their under their rule, except for kind of like about 10% of the country, which is a small kind of rump state of the leftover warlords allied together, and they're called the Northern Alliance. Right before the Taliban is able to finally defeat the Northern Alliance and unify Afghanistan at all, though, for all time, the events of 9/11 happen. America invades Afghanistan, and because of that awkward relationship they had with Al Qaeda, with Osama bin Laden giving them support to win the war, they were housing Osama bin Laden there, so it led to the invasion of Afghanistan, as every American knows. And to quote a stupid meme, everything changed when America attacked. America rapidly took most of the major cities with its pretty small, incredibly small, pretty much just like special forces, Green Berets, some paratroopers and rangers and stuff like that, allied with the Northern Alliance. They're able to, on paper, sweep over the entire country and defeat the Taliban in record time. The reality, though, is that this tiny force was utterly incapable of preventing the retreating and regrouping of Taliban forces in the south of the country and out of harm's way in the western expanses of Pakistan. The Taliban clearly were not defeated and only simply withdrew from the countryside. America then established a weak puppet government, which was now known as the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. America were very idiotic, and because they had not recognized the Taliban as the legitimate government after they unified the country and took Kabul in the 1990s, refused to allow the Taliban to be treated as an opposing army, as an opposing state. And what they did is that they called them unlawful combatants, and any captured Taliban were kidnapped, essentially, and put into prison. Instead of trying to negotiate with the Taliban and recognizing them as a government, let's say they would have done with Nazi Germany, maybe like even in the case of Nazi Germany, unconditional surrender. Rather, they chose to completely think that they're completely illegitimate and just take them prisoner, kidnap them, take them into prison, and many of the highest officials, right, they're going to get kidnapped, take halfway across the world to this bastard base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, and they're tortured. And because America offers no quarters to the Taliban, that greatly hardens the resolve of the Taliban and kind of pushes them forward to continue to resist America for the next 20 years. Since they were refused the honor of conventions of war, and by the way, on America's side, it's not like the Taliban would have recognized the conventions of war either, right? They during the Civil War, when they were combatant, they did all kinds of like massacres and war crimes. So, but just saying, kidnapping them and refusing to accept them as a legitimate government and negotiate with them after they were somewhat, or some people could argue, were defeated. Pretty gigantic, boneheaded move. Following this initial invasion, America just kind of stood there with a very small garrison force, kind of only in Kabul. Um, and they had these very limited missions to attack the Taliban, which allowed them to build up for years. And it really wasn't until Obama took office around 2009 that Obama tried to have a surge of American and NATO troops in the country. But by that time, the Taliban had been allowed to build up, mostly unharassed, within southern Afghanistan and to have bases across the border with inside of Pakistan itself. Pakistan and the Taliban have an incredibly complex relationship of frenemies. Sometimes the Taliban will be fighting against the Pakistani government, there being a Pakistani Taliban. Sometimes they're straight up allies, right? And so, because of that, Pakistan is very half heartedly fighting them. America is kind of looking the other way, way focused on Iraq versus Afghanistan, and they're just able to build up all that time. So Obama briefly does this surge to try and win the war. Doesn't work out, it's indecisive. Then the war just drags on after that surge for years and years and years and years. Basically, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, is basically just Kabul. It's just a fortress city that America holds a garrison with. And on paper, America has, you know, regional capitals for all the different regions of the country, which are directly connected to Kabul. But that's not really true, as the Taliban is able to bribe all these regional officials. So as soon as America finally withdraws, all these regional officials are bribed. Massive amounts of the officer corps is just directly bribed by the Taliban. They flip over en masse and attack, a very limited amount of forces loyal to the Republic, which will defend Kabul, and Kabul falls in a matter of weeks. And America is essentially defeated while it still has a substantial presence on the ground and it hasn't finished its evacuation. And America is basically stuck in this airport at the mercy and surrounded by the Taliban. The most humiliating defeat in all of American history. And following that, the Taliban is able to unify all of the country. There's one valley that were resisting them, which was quickly defeated. The Taliban unifies the entire country, controls the entire country, something it had failed to do prior to America's invasion in 2001. That was in 2021, and here we are today. The Taliban are a very extreme Islamic theocracy, which maintains control of the country. So I'm going to go through my 5 factors if a country is based. We got support for traditional families, support for the general welfare of the primary ethnic group of the state, support for the continued existence of that ethnic group and its inheritance, promotion of the traditional culture of that ethnic group, and the sovereignty and stability of the state. First off, let's start with support for traditional families. The current total fertility rate of Afghanistan is about 4.75 births per woman, and that was in 2020, before the Taliban took over. So that means that the country, with a total population of something like 40 million, has more live births than either Japan, which is at 125 million, or Russia, which is at like 145 million. So that's pretty cool, huh? With the ban on education, though, that the Taliban has recently enacted, for women, that is, taking effect, we should expect the birth rate actually to surge even higher. I just want to take note for a second. When we look at a country like Afghanistan with a 4.75 TFR rate, and we're like, well, you look backwards and there's an 8 TFR at like 1900. You got to realize is that even if Afghanistan today has a pretty low mortality or a pretty high mortality rate globally, it's a lot lower than it was historically. So if there were historical TFRs of 8, you got to understand that functionally that doesn't mean that a woman gave birth to 8 children and those 8 children survived into adulthood, right? You got to factor in infant mortality being far higher and a general high child mortality rate, which kind of pushes down completed fertility. So functionally, those historical TFRs are similar to a TFR of 4 today. That also means that countries like Afghanistan or South Sudan or Somalia that have these extremely high TFRs today, their replacement rate isn't actually 2.1 or 2.2. It's probably higher towards like 2.5 or 2.6 because they have a generally lower life expectancy, a much higher, though in terms of the history of the human race, not very high infant mortality rate, and a generally higher child mortality rate. Anyway, switching back to the most blunt and basic pronatalist program you could have. Ban women from education, ban contraception, which I don't even know if it's banned, it's just not available because a country's so primordial and so backwards, right? And in such a complete state of disarray. And then ban women from the workplace, force them to be married early, and then finally keep them at home taking care of the kids no matter what. So I guess the Taliban is super brutal, right? But the pronatalist policies are going to be effective, and Afghanistan is going to be a breeder country, to be sure. Now let's go to another factor in terms of support for traditional families. Homosexuality is illegal and punishable by death. I don't even know if transsexuality is a thing there. I just assume that it'd just be punished by death as well. I don't even know if abortion is banned. I guess technically abortion is banned, but it doesn't even really matter because there's so little hospitals and there's not really any medical staff that aren't coming from aid organizations anyway. That it doesn't even matter because nobody can even perform an abortion. Okay, support for the general welfare of the primary ethnic group of the state. So Afghanistan is amongst one of the top 5 poorest countries in the world. Any industrialization that occurred before the Civil War began in 1978 has basically been destroyed because of the constant warfare. The United States really didn't go anywhere in attempting to exploit the mineral resources of the nation. There is some limited mining. The Taliban seemingly have no plan for any real industrialization, though, so far. And no country recognizes the Taliban government since they took power back in 2021, so foreign investment seems off the table. Economically speaking, the best that they can really hope for is being a hub for transportation for countries across the border, selling abandoned military equipment left by the United States, and selling the cash crops of illegal drugs. By the way, they're the most important country in the production of illegal drugs in the world. I think that they're the first highest producer of opium and the second highest producer of cannabis or marijuana. Although I want to say, before I get into that, in any real extent, you got to remember that the Taliban had it legal for a while and then banned it in 2000. And the reason that they waited so long to ban it was that they're trying to use it as a bargaining chip to gain international recognition. Ultimately, though, they didn't want it legal and they banned it anyway, as keeping opium legal in the country, because any opium being around is going to have obvious blowback effects and hurt their country and their health. Anyway, though, Afghanistan is one of the countries in the world with the highest maternal mortality rate. It has a very high rate of infant mortality compared to all other nations in the world. In 2020, its life expectancy was about 62, but I think you should take all the pre-Taliban conquest data with a grain of salt. First of all, because the Taliban took over, and second of all, because the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan really didn't control the country anyway. So I really don't want to focus on those numbers. What we know overall is Afghanistan has one of the lowest standards of living in the entire world. There's only a handful of sub-Saharan African countries that really can compare with them. And those countries are countries like Somalia and South Sudan, which have been in constant warfare for decades as well. Also, you got to keep in mind is that once the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan fell and America abandoned Kabul to its ultimate fate, the people, the Afghan expats and the people that were being educated for the past 20 years, most of them have fled the country, and that's resulted in an incredible brain drain effect, right? Really, Afghanistan has essentially no economic future. And going back to the fate of women there, the country has one of the highest rates of domestic abuse in the world, with the majority of women suffering domestic abuse in their lifetime. Has one of the highest rapes probably in the world as well. Women are barred from education. They're required to wear full body coverings. They're barred from the vast majority of jobs. They're not allowed to travel on their own without close male relatives. The Taliban approves of very young marriage, in some cases child marriage, right? So fun, fun, fun for women, I guess, right? Okay, let's get to support for the continued existence of that ethnic group and its inheritance. The Taliban represent a return of power to the Pashtuns, which are the largest ethnic group in the country. Afghanistan historically was a Pashtun empire, and Afghanistan controlled much of western Pakistan historically. They've only been pushed back by the Raj, and the country's really a rump state as it's existed for the past 150 years or so. So in the Afghanistan of the past, at its greater extent, it would have been a Pashtun majority country. But Afghanistan views itself in retrospect, the Pashtuns at least, towards that past. So even though that they're a plurality, they view themselves as the natural rulers of the country, and that Afghanistan is a Pashtun country, not a country made up of multiple ethnic groups. Communist Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan were made up disproportionately of these smaller ethnic groups. The Hazaras, the third largest ethnic group in the country, which comprised about 10% of the population, comprised about 25% of seats within the legislative body. They're highly overrepresented. I do believe they're more educated, but when the Taliban were conquering the country the first time, they did a lot of massacres of other ethnic groups, primarily Uzbeks and Hazaris. I've noticed it's really hard to get the data on this for the birth rates of individual groups or versus each other for the different ethnic groups or different regions of the country. And to top that off, it's going to be hard just to get any data because even when the country was under the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, it wasn't really controlled by the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, as I've said multiple times. So anyway, a lot of people do think that the Taliban's rule has changed fertility amongst the different ethnic groups, and that Pashtuns have probably moved from a plurality somewhere in the 40% to just slightly the majority somewhere in the 50% of the country. So I guess the Taliban is kind of pushing forward Pashtuns to get their traditional power back over the country. Now let's go to promotion of the traditional culture of that ethnic group. The Taliban represent an Islam which is more extreme than Muhammad. When they first ruled, music, television, radio, and almost all forms of mass media were banned by them. Since they have returned to power, a lot of people around the world are waiting to see what they'll do. There's reason to believe that they're going to be more lenient this time, as when they were in resistance and in insurgency, things like their radio program broadcasts were really helpful as a channel of recruitment, sharing news to the civilians that supported them, and boosting the morale of Afghans that resisted the NATO occupation. So far, all they've really done to clamp down on foreign media is, of course, censorship under traditional Islamic fashion, right? Conservative censorship, and then they banned all foreign television programs. And, usually on this I touch upon religion, but the Taliban are foundationally a religious movement, right? They're foundationally Sunni. You could describe them kind of as a new Sunni cult. But, so even if the Taliban's interpretation of Islam is quite strict and more extreme than the Islam which existed in the country for the past few centuries, there's no question that the Taliban takeover means a resurgence of Sunni Islam, and that the religion is returned to the center stage into the life and culture of the country, following the various liberal and somewhat secularizing regimes for the past 40 years. Ooh, baby, the sovereignty and stability of the state. The Taliban has driven out the United States after a protracted 20-year struggle from 2001 to 2021. As such, they have definitively established their sovereignty in a military sense or a territorial sense. Afghanistan, while not having a conventional military, is essentially unoccupiable. There is little within the country for an invader to take, and even less for an invader to destroy. With the Soviet invasion from 79 to 89 and America's invasion and war from 2001 to 2021, Afghanistan defeated both major great world powers in a protracted war of attrition. With both of these great powers defeated and reeling in their defeats, there's no reason for any other country really to invade it. Its much smaller neighbors really couldn't have any hope in trying to conquer the country, and if they did, what would it lead to if Iran tried to punitively invade Afghanistan to try and protect the Hazaris? At the end of the day, what does Iran have that they can hold above the head of the Taliban? There's nothing there. Everything's been destroyed. And so the country doesn't really fear anybody. Afghanistan has essentially no economic future, though. It is one of the countries in the world which is most dependent upon food aid. While the stability that the Taliban have created in the country once they've taken it back over might mean an increase in food production, it's a long way to go until they would be self-sufficient. And as such, that means that Afghanistan is largely dependent upon handouts from a world which they disapprove and a world which greatly disapproves of them. This goes into a deeper question. Is it more base to be dependent upon handouts, to be dependent on welfare? Is it more cringe to be dependent on welfare? What if you're taking welfare away from your enemies? And you're basically guilting that into it. Well, who's more cringe there? The person who's giving free aid to his enemy so he can continue to exist? Or the person who isn't working, the person who isn't self-sufficient? And that's what you got to ask yourself when it comes to Afghanistan and the Taliban. They're completely dependent upon the world. The world hates them, and they hate the world back, but the world continues to feed them. And basically, they're holding the entire country ransom under the threat of famine. And the entire world doesn't want to see that famine to happen, so they keep feeding the country. And because they have such a high birth rate, they're feeding this overpopulated country which can't sustain itself, and it's growing faster and faster and faster. It's like this huge blister of chaos, which in the long term is very dangerous, right? Pakistan heavily funded the Taliban at various times since the movement first originated. There were some key advantages for a Taliban government to exist in Afghanistan for Pakistan. There would be no Afghan-Indian alliance if such as once you have the Taliban in power, right? It means that Afghanistan would be more stable, so hopefully there would be a lot less refugees coming over. Refugees in Pakistan could go back, right? And it also means it's a lot safer to trade across the border back to Iran, back to Central Asia especially. So it was kind of a boon. The problem is that the Taliban, they're hated by the rest of the world. They're funding terrorism inside of Pakistan. And there's parts of the Taliban that want to reunify and create a Pashtun state over the Pashtun areas of Pakistan, right? But, you know, seems that that's kind of over. The Pakistanis have kicked out the Taliban, and it's just Taliban are restrained for the time being within Afghanistan. So the Taliban were able to defeat America, regain control of Afghanistan, but they don't have control of the traditional Afghanistan, and they have no real ability to conquer any other country, such as the vast swaths of Afghanistan, which are vast swaths of Pakistan, sorry, which were traditionally would have been part of Afghanistan. Now let's get to the conclusion. Afghanistan is a miserable and terrible, wretched, horrible place to live. It's one, though, which has pushed out two incredibly strong foreign invasions, and because of those defeats of those great foreign enemies, the Taliban have a free hand to impose whatever they want, and they've chosen to impose extremely socially conservative policies for the most part, and these policies will aggressively increase the population for the near, medium term, and medium term future. As long as that international food keeps coming in, and with the world as weak and frail as it is, and with the decline of industrialization being slow, you know, we shouldn't be surprised if Afghanistan breaks 100 million, or even if it breaks 150 million. It'll be this horrible, wretched, overpopulated place to live. But as soon as that food money goes out, right, Afghanistan's not going to be able to support itself, and it'll suffer a dreadful famine. So, in regards to the long-term future, Afghanistan, because the way it is after so many years of war, is really already living in kind of an post-industrial age. And if it can kind of bribe its way through famine, or out of famine, stave off famine indefinitely, it's quite possible if those Afghan numbers keep up, we're going to see a migration of Afghanis southwards and maybe even into Central Asia, and they'll conquer those fertile lands searching for expansion after they're overpopulated and for food. So maybe the Taliban in the distant future, in like 2100, 2150, right? The Afghanistan that was laid the foundations by the Taliban could end up creating another great South Asian empire, which has its capital within Kabul or within Kandahar. But that distant future possible victory, if such a thing indeed does happen, will have been built upon a huge mountain of corpses and misery. So then, what do you think? Is Afghanistan and the Taliban which rule it, are they based? You decide.